The deadline for the surgery's final payment is the 17th, 14 days, $40,000. It wasn't a round number, which felt deliberate, a kind of cruelty built into the system. Every other option had fallen through. The small business loan was denied. My mom had already stretched herself thin with the initial costs, and selling the car well, that just meant my wife Sarah would be relying on rides to chemo, and that wasn't happening. So here I was, staring at the chipped Formica counter of Galaxy Games, an arcade that unbelievably stayed open until 4 in the morning. It smelled like stale pizza and desperation, and honestly, it was the most hopeful I'd felt in weeks. The place was expansive, bigger inside than it looked from the street. Rows and rows of machines, mostly older stuff, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, a surprisingly well-maintained pinball alley. The air was thick with the low hum of electricity and the ghostly echoes of beeps and boops. The carpet was a faded, swirling pattern of neon colors, worn thin in high-traffic areas. It smelled faintly of dust and something metallic, like old wiring. Behind the counter, a small break room was visible, cluttered with a microwave and a half-empty soda machine. There were security cameras everywhere, little black domes watching from the ceiling. Weston, the manager, a guy with tired eyes and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, had just handed me a thick binder and a set of keys, mumbled something about just keeping an eye on things, and then left. He didn't even ask if I had any questions. It was mostly empty when I arrived. A few stragglers nursing tokens, kids with their parents. A teenage couple huddled in the Dance Dance Revolution booth, oblivious to everything else. I started going through the binder's standard stuff. Opening and closing procedures, emergency contacts, a surprisingly detailed section on cleaning the ticket redemption machines. Then, tucked between the section on fire safety and employee conduct, I found it. A few sheets of paper, stapled together, with a list of rules. The first one read, "At shift start, check all floor drains in the game room. If any drain is covered with anything that was not placed there by maintenance, uncover it using the provided tool, not your hands, and report." I blinked. Floor drains? Seriously? I glanced around, spotting the metal grates near the back, tucked under the air hockey tables. What was that about? Some kind of weird health code thing? Probably just the owner being overly cautious. Number 2. Every visitor receives a badge at entry. At the end of each shift, count the returned badges. The number returned must equal the number issued. If it does not, do not leave. Okay, that was odd. Like a very specific, very low-stakes version of a prison movie. I pictured myself stuck here all night because someone walked out with a little plastic badge. It was ridiculous. If a coworker doesn't appear for their shift and doesn't call, do not cover their station. Leave it empty and log the absence. Do not attempt to contact them. That one felt cold, but again, probably just a liability thing. Avoid responsibility. Don't get involved. The list went on. If your footsteps echo in an area where they normally don't, stop walking and stand still for 30 seconds before continuing. Never count aloud on the premises. Do not run on the premises for any reason. If someone is in the public waiting area after closing time, do not approach them alone. If asked directly whether you have seen or heard anything unusual, say no. Do not fall asleep anywhere on the premises except the designated rest area. And then, the last one. On arriving at the start of every shift, say the following phrase aloud before doing anything else. The static clears, the signal holds. It was all so strange. Some kind of elaborate prank, maybe. A previous employee with a penchant for the theatrical? I almost laughed. It was just a job. A weird late-night job, but just a job. I needed the money. Sarah needed the surgery. I set the rules aside, grabbed the drain cleaning tool, a long hooked metal rod, and started towards the back of the arcade. I figured I'd get the drain thing out of the way, then focus on learning the badge system. I walked past the pinball machines, their lights flashing, and paused. My shoes sounded louder than they should. A distinct tap-tap-tap on the worn carpet. I dismissed it. Old building, bad acoustics. Still, I slowed my pace, trying to be quiet. But then, as I walked past the air hockey tables, it happened again. A clear, distinct echo with every step. It wasn't a reverberation, not exactly. It sounded like another set of footsteps, mirroring my own, but slightly delayed. I stopped, heart quickening. 30 seconds, the rule said. Just stand still. I stood there, rigidly listening, the hum of the arcade seeming to press in on me. I spent the next hour mostly wandering, trying to memorize the layout of the place. It wasn't just the games. It was the little alcoves, the dead ends, the way the carpet changed color in different sections. I needed to know this place, not for security, but just to not feel lost. It was a dumb feeling being lost in an arcade, but I hadn't felt particularly found in a long time either. I checked the bathrooms, restocking the paper towels and soap dispensers. Cleaned up a spilled soda near the skee-ball machines. It was mindless work, the kind that let my brain drift. I kept replaying the conversation with Weston, trying to remember if he'd said anything else about the rules. Anything that might make sense of them. Nothing. Just keep an eye on things. Around 10, the last of the families trickled out. The teenage couple finally detached from the dance revolution, looking dazed and sweaty. After they left, the arcade fell into a quiet hum. It was a different kind of quiet than at home, a mechanical quiet, filled with the low thrum of electricity and the occasional ping of a machine resetting. I walked back behind the counter, brewed a cup of the terrible coffee Weston had left in the pot, and started to tackle the badge system. There were stacks of the plastic cards, bright yellow with the Galaxy Games logo printed on them. A sign-in sheet for visitors, a box for the returned badges. Weston hadn't bothered to explain it, just pointed and said, "They give them to people when they come in, they give them back when they leave." Simple enough. I started to count the badges in the box, comparing the number to the entries on the sign-in sheet from the previous day. It matched. Good. One less thing to worry about. The drain inspection. I kept putting it off. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad joke. But the rules were the rules, and Weston hadn't seemed to think it was funny. I grabbed the metal hook again, the cool steel surprisingly heavy in my hand, and headed towards the back of the arcade, where the air hockey tables were clustered. The carpet was particularly worn in that area, faded almost to white in places. I found the first drain, tucked under the table furthest from the counter. It was a simple metal grate, set flush with the floor. I knelt down, shining the flashlight from my phone into the opening. Empty. The next one was partially obscured by a stack of discarded prize tickets. I cleared them away, and there it was, covered. Not with trash, not with dirt, but with a flat, circular piece of something. It was dark gray, almost black, and smooth to the eye. It looked like a thick rubber disc, maybe a foot in diameter. I frowned. Who would put that there? And why? It wasn't something that would have fallen in accidentally. I reached for it, intending to just pry it up with a hook. It was probably some kind of maintenance cover, I reasoned. Weston was just being paranoid about someone falling in. The metal felt cold against my palm as I positioned the hook under the edge of the disc. Just a quick lift, and then I could get this over with. But as I started to pull, a smell hit me. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong. Like wet stone and something metallic, but underneath that, something else. Something like ozone, like right before a thunderstorm. And then, a faint vibration through the floor, barely perceptible but enough to make the coffee in my mug ripple. I paused, my hand hovering over the disc. That wasn't right. I lowered the hook slightly. The vibration stopped. I tried again, applying a little more pressure. The vibration returned, stronger this time, and the smell intensified. It made the back of my throat ache. I pulled my hand back completely, staring at the disc. It wasn't just resting on the drain. It felt held, like something was pressing up against it from underneath, keeping it in place. The metal hook clinked against the floor. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize it. Static electricity, maybe? Some kind of resonance from the machines? The building was old, the wiring probably ancient. It was probably just a coincidence. Just a weird, unsettling coincidence. But the smell and the vibration. I positioned the hook again, this time keeping my hand well clear. I slid the hook under the edge of the disc and pulled. It lifted easily, almost too easily, but it wasn't light. It felt heavy, strangely weighted. As I lifted it, I saw what was holding it down. Not a mechanism, not a spring, but a dark, slick surface undulating slightly, like muscle. It receded as the disc came up, disappearing into the darkness of the drain. I dropped the disc, the sound echoing in the quiet arcade. I stared at the open drain, the flashlight beam illuminating the slick, dark interior. I hadn't touched it with my hands, but I'd been close, too close. I backed away slowly, my gaze fixed on the drain, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The smell lingered, a phantom presence in the air. I needed to report this. Weston needed to know. But I didn't want to go near that drain again. Not even to look. The image of whatever was down there, that shifting, dark surface, was burned into my mind. I turned and walked quickly back to the counter, the metal hook still clutched in my hand. I needed to write this down, not for Weston, but for myself. I spent the next hour cleaning up spilled soda and arranging the plush toys in the claw machines. It was mindless work, the kind that almost managed to quiet the churning in my stomach almost. Every time I glanced towards the back of the arcade, my eyes snagged on the space where I'd found that thing. I kept telling myself it was just a weird maintenance access point, poorly designed and neglected. Probably filled with dust and cobwebs, not whatever it was. I even went back, pretending to check the air hockey tables, just to confirm the rubber disc was still lying next to the drain. It was. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, a constant irritating drone. I adjusted the thermostat, turning the temperature down 1 degree. Bev had mentioned the arcade got stuffy when it wasn't busy, and I was starting to feel it. It was almost 3 a.m. and the place was dead. A couple of teenagers had come and gone around 10, mostly hanging around the dance machine, but otherwise just me and the blinking beeping machines. I ran a damp cloth over the counter, wiping away the sticky residue from forgotten drinks. I thought about Petra, working the day shift, and wondered if she ever felt this isolated. I'd gotten the visitor log organized too. Just a simple spiral-bound notebook with columns for name, time in, and time out. Mostly kids, a few parents, the occasional late-night gamer. I flipped through the pages, checking for any discrepancies. That's when I remembered the badges. Weston's rules, I hadn't even thought about them since the initial briefing. The rule about the badges, it was something about counting them, making sure everyone who came in also went out. It wasn't phrased clearly, I remembered, more like a warning. Ensure balance, the phrase kept coming back to me. Ensure balance, as if an imbalance meant something bad would happen. I shook my head, just being paranoid probably. Old building, old rules, old man making a fuss about nothing. I pulled the box of unused badges from under the counter. Still a full stack, neatly arranged. Then I went to the drop-off slot next to the entrance, where visitors returned their badges on the way out. I started counting. 1, 2, 3, up to 27. 27 badges returned. I checked the log again, cross-referencing names with the time and entries. 28 people had signed in. 28 badges should have been returned. I recounted the pile, 27. I checked the log again, meticulously comparing each name. No mistakes on my end. No one had signed out twice. 27 returned, 28 signed in. I felt a prickle of unease, one missing. I flipped back through the log, scanning for any unusual entries. Anything that might explain the discrepancy. And then I saw it. The last entry. Rowan Bellwether, signed in at 8:17 p.m., Rowan Bellwether. The name didn't ring a bell. I couldn't recall seeing anyone matching that description. I flipped back several weeks, searching for the name. Nothing. Then I went back months. And there it was. 6 months ago, November 12th. Rowan Bellwether signed in at 9:43 p.m. and signed out at 11:58 p.m. a winter night, a completely different shift. What was that doing here in the current log? It wasn't a new entry. It was a repeat. A ghost from 6 months past. My pulse quickened. I went back to the entrance, staring at the security camera monitors. The cameras covered the entrance and the main arcade floor, but not the back corners. I rewound the footage to 8 p.m. and started watching. The usual trickle of late-night visitors. A couple of kids playing air hockey, a lone guy nursing a soda while playing pinball. No Rowan Bellwether. I fast-forwarded, scanning faces. Still nothing. I rewound again, slowing the footage down, scrutinizing every person who passed through the entrance. And then, I saw it. A figure, walking in at 8:16 p.m., wearing a dark hoodie, face obscured by shadows. They signed the log, took a badge, and walked into the arcade. But something was off. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, almost like stop-motion animation, and their face I couldn't make out any features, just a blurred, indistinct shape. I replayed the clip several times, each time feeling a growing sense of dread. It wasn't a clear image. It could have been the camera angle, the poor lighting, anything. But it felt wrong. Terribly wrong. I checked the footage from the other cameras, trying to track the figure's movements. It appeared and disappeared, flickering in and out of view, like a glitch in the system. I looked back at the visitor log. Rowan Bellwether, 6 months ago. And tonight, I thought about the rules, about ensuring balance, about what Weston hadn't said. I went to the back of the arcade, towards the drain, and stopped. The air felt colder back there, heavier. I didn't go near the drain. I didn't want to, but I kept glancing at it. I had a feeling whatever was happening wasn't about the missing badge, but about who or what had signed the log 6 months ago and somehow was still here. I grabbed a chair and sat near the counter, watching the entrance. I wasn't going anywhere, not until morning, not until the next shift, and not until I understood what I'd just seen. I started a new page in the visitor log, writing only one word at the top, Rowan. I was wiping down the prize counter, the sticky film of spilled soda and melted chocolate, stubbornly clinging to the laminate. It was a pointless task, really. The prizes hadn't been touched in days, mostly cheap plastic toys, faded plushies, and those little bouncy balls that always smelled faintly of rubber and regret. I used the citrus-scented cleaner, hoping the smell would cut through the general arcade funk, a combination of stale popcorn, dust, and something vaguely electrical. It didn't, not really. It just added another layer. I'd gone through the bathrooms twice already, scrubbed the floors, and restocked the paper towel dispensers. Anything to keep busy, anything to avoid staring at the security monitors, at the empty spaces between the games, at the drain in the back room. The name Rowan felt like a weight in my chest, a dull ache that wouldn't go away. I kept replaying that footage, trying to make sense of the blurred figure, the unnatural movements. It was probably just a glitch, some kind of digital artifact. The cameras were old, the resolution was terrible. People looked weird on security footage all the time. Around 11:45, I checked the time clock. Bev's shift started in 15 minutes. Bev was usually on time, always cheerful, always brought in homemade cookies. She'd been working at Galaxy Games for 15 years, practically lived here. I figured she'd have some explanation for the Rowan Bellwether entry, some story about a forgotten name, a clerical error. I was relieved. I didn't want to be the one to deal with it. I just wanted my shift to end. Then 11:55 came and went. No Bev, no cookies. I checked the time clock again. Still nothing. I glanced at the employee schedule posted near the counter. Bev was definitely scheduled. I started to feel a flicker of concern. Bev never missed a shift. I picked up the phone, hovering over the speed dial for her number. Then I remembered. The binder, the rules. Something about a missing employee. I flipped through the pages, the plastic crackling under my fingers. There it was, buried amongst the regulations about game maintenance and customer complaints. R95, the no-call absence rule. It was short, blunt. If a coworker doesn't appear for their shift and doesn't call, do not cover their station. Leave it empty and log the absence. Do not attempt to contact them. I frowned. That was odd. Why wouldn't I be allowed to cover her station? It made no sense. Probably just some archaic policy, something put in place years ago to deal with disgruntled employees or no-shows. It was a relic from a different time, before people relied on text messages and instant communication. If Bev was simply running late, a family emergency, something like that, leaving her station empty would just cause confusion. It would look bad. But the rule was clear. Do not cover their station. And some nagging instinct I couldn't articulate, told me to follow it. It wasn't about the inconvenience or looking bad, or even Bev. It was about something else. Something about not disrupting something, about acknowledging a space that was meant to be empty. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I looked at the door, at the empty space where Bev should be. I should call, I thought, just to check. But the rule held me back. I logged Bev's absence in the employee log, noting the time and the no-call, no-show status. It felt wrong, deeply wrong. I wanted to call, to check on her, to reassure myself that everything was okay, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. The rule was there, a firm barrier in my mind. I spent the next hour staring at Bev's empty station. The change felt significant. The arcade felt different with her absence acknowledged, marked by the empty chair, the untouched register. The air felt colder, the silence heavier. I kept replaying that security footage of Rowan Bellwether in my head. It felt connected now, somehow. The missing badge, the repeat entry, the unexplained figure, and now a missing employee who hadn't even bothered to call. I hadn't touched the drain since finding the pulsating surface. I hadn't even walked near it. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was happening wasn't about the drain anymore. It was about the absences, about the spaces left unfilled, and I had just made one of those spaces bigger. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m., still a long night ahead, and now a growing fear that Bev wouldn't be the last one to disappear. I refilled my coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to warm me. The citrus cleaner had completely evaporated, leaving only the arcade funk hanging in the air. It smelled like something was rotting. I was restocking the prize counter. Mostly cheap plastic toys, stuffed animals with mismatched eyes, those little bouncy balls that smelled like rubber and regret. It was a mindless task, the kind that at least occupied my hands while my mind replayed the same few anxieties. The medical bills, the chemo schedule, whether I'd remembered to thaw the chicken for tomorrow night. I was arranging a pyramid of light-up yo-yos, trying to get the base even, when I decided to sweep the floor under the counter. It was always a mess down there, littered with ticket stubs and dropped candy. The floor was concrete, smooth and worn from years of kids and spilled soda. I hadn't really noticed it before, not consciously, but it was always dead. Acoustically dead, I guess. The arcade was loud, always buzzing with electronic sounds and shouting, but the concrete floor never seemed to carry the sound. It just absorbed it. It wasn't a plush carpet, but it wasn't echoing either, just nothing. I pushed the broom in long, even strokes, working from the back of the counter toward the entrance. That's when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible echo. Just my footsteps, but returning. It was subtle, a ghost of a sound, but it was definitely there. I stopped sweeping, leaning on the broom handle, listening. Another step, another echo. It was like standing in a hallway rather than under a prize counter. The sound wasn't loud, not jarring, just wrong. I told myself it was the lack of people. Bev's absence had changed the soundscape, maybe thinned it out enough to reveal some quirk of the building's acoustics, or maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and worry. It was easy to start imagining things when you spent your nights surrounded by flashing lights and artificial noise. I was probably just hearing things. But I remembered something then. A fragment of that binder, a rule buried in the procedural nonsense. Something about echoes. If you heard an echo where you shouldn't, it wasn't R95 that was about people, this was different. I couldn't quite recall the wording. Something about stopping, about waiting. A vague sense of unease settled in my chest, heavier than the usual anxiety. It wasn't a logical fear, not a fear of something specific, just a primal sense that something was fundamentally out of place. I stopped walking, just stood there, broom in hand, listening. The echoes continued with each small shift of my weight, each breath. They weren't getting fainter, weren't dying away. They were consistent, almost present, as if the sound wasn't bouncing off a wall, but being produced by the floor itself. I'd been in this arcade for months. I knew this floor. It didn't echo. 30 seconds. That's what I remembered. 30 seconds. It felt arbitrary, ridiculous. But the image of the binder, the stern black lettering, the weight of those rules, was vivid in my mind. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction. I forced myself to remain perfectly still, my muscles screaming in protest. The arcade sounds, the blips and bloops of the games, the distant chatter seemed to fade, replaced by the insistent rhythmic echo of my own stillness. The echo didn't stop when I stopped moving. It didn't lessen, didn't distort. It simply continued, matching my stillness, mirroring it, as if my body had become a source of the sound rather than a generator of it. It was subtle, but the effect was profoundly unsettling. I pictured the space around me, the concrete floor, the rows of games, the empty doorway to the back room. I tried to visualize what might be causing the echo, what could have changed the acoustics so dramatically. Nothing came to mind. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was probably closer to 40 seconds, I took a step. A small one to the side. The echo shifted, mirroring my movement. I took another step, then another, carefully moving away from the prize counter toward the entrance. The echo followed me, consistently, perfectly. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what might be generating the sound. I just kept walking, putting as much distance between myself and the prize counter as possible. I walked toward the front entrance, toward the security cameras, toward the possibility of someone, anyone, arriving. I walked until the echo faded, until it became indistinguishable from the general din of the arcade. I stopped just short of the entrance, my back to the prize counter, breathing heavily. The floor felt solid under my feet, normal. The echo was gone. But the feeling of wrongness lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. I glanced back, briefly, at the prize counter. Nothing appeared different. The light-up yo-yos still formed an imperfect pyramid. The floor looked like a floor. But I knew something had been there. Something that had altered the space, shifted the acoustics, and followed my every move. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever it was, I hadn't seen it. I had avoided it. I'd walked away from something I didn't understand, and in doing so, had acknowledged its presence. I straightened the employee schedule on the counter, carefully avoiding looking at the space where Bev's name was listed. I needed to check the security cameras. There was a blind spot near the back, by the entrance to the storage room. I hadn't thought much of it before, but now it felt like a deliberate omission. A space left empty, waiting, and I had a sudden, unsettling urge to check the drain. I didn't, not yet, but I knew I would. I started restocking the slushy machines. It was a losing battle, honestly. Kids treated those things like demolition derbies, shoving cups under the spouts, overfilling them, leaving sticky puddles everywhere. Strawberry was the worst, always the worst. It stained everything. I had a whole system: empty the bins, refill with concentrate, add water, stir, pray it didn't jam, repeat. It was mindless, which after the last hour was exactly what I needed. The plastic of the concentrate jugs was cold against my palms. It was probably the coldest thing I'd touched all night, colder even than the metal spigot on the soda fountain. My hands felt off though, not numb, exactly. More like a dull ache, settled deep in the base of my fingers. I'd been gripping the broom too tight earlier. I figured, probably just circulation. Petra always said I held things like I was expecting them to run away. I finished the strawberry, moved on to blue raspberry. The machine sputtered and coughed, refusing to dispense. I gave the lever a firm push, then another. Still nothing. Probably a blockage. I grabbed a long plastic spoon from under the counter and started fishing around inside the machine, trying to dislodge whatever was causing the problem. I had to get this going. Friday night was coming, and Friday night meant a rush on the blue raspberry. I started counting the individual ice crystals as I pulled them out. Just to, I don't know, occupy myself. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a weird habit. I'd always done it when I was stressed, and honestly, the whole night had been one long, low-level stress. 7, 8, 9. I was almost to 10 when it hit me. I stopped. I'd been going through that binder again in my head, flipping through the policies like a deck of cards. And something about numbers, something about saying numbers. It wasn't R99, that was about the badges. This was smaller, more precise. A little voice, not my own, seemed to whisper in the back of my mind, never count aloud. It was flimsy, a half-remembered phrase, easily dismissed. This was just a nervous tick. A stupid thing to do while fixing a slushy machine. I'd been working too much, not sleeping enough. My brain was playing tricks on me. I started counting again. 10, 11, 12. No, wait. I'd lost track. I started over. 1, 2, 3. I got to 7 this time, and something felt wrong. Not the ache in my hands, something else. A subtle shift in the air, a flicker in the fluorescent lights. The machine gurgled as if responding to my voice. I paused, spoon hovering over the ice crystals. I counted again, slowly, deliberately. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 11. 11? I was certain I'd only taken out 10. I'd been keeping a running tally in my head, visually tracking each crystal. There was no way I'd missed one, let alone added an extra. It was ridiculous. I emptied the spoon into the bin and started again, determined to prove myself right. 1, 2, 3, 4. This time, I focused intensely, watching each crystal fall, willing the count to be accurate. 7, 8, 9, 13. 13. That's when the lights flickered again. A longer, more pronounced dip this time, and the machine, instead of sputtering, started to hum. A low, resonant vibration that spread through the counter and into my hands. I dropped the spoon. I didn't count anymore. I just stared at the machine, at the swirling blue liquid, at the growing sense of dread that was tightening in my chest. I needed to clear my head. I needed to check the drain. I hadn't, despite what I told myself, gotten over the feeling that thing was wrong. It wasn't a logical feeling, just wrong. I walked towards the back room, bypassing the prize counter and carefully stepping around the scattered arcade tokens. The back room was dim, lit only by a single bare bulb. The drain was in the corner, the metal disc still firmly in place. I knelt down, ignoring the ache in my knees, and examined it more closely. It hadn't moved, it hadn't changed, but the air around it felt colder. I didn't touch it, I just looked. And as I looked, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Scratches. Faint, almost imperceptible scratches on the concrete floor surrounding the drain. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, a series of intersecting lines that resembled a grid. And in the center of the grid, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small, perfectly circular indentation, as if something had been pressed down there repeatedly, leaving its mark. I didn't need to touch it to know it wasn't there yesterday. I didn't need to touch it to know I wasn't going to sleep tonight. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff. I needed a coffee, a strong one, and I needed to start a log, a written log. No counting, just observations. I grabbed a notepad and pen from the break room and sat back down at the counter. The image of that grid burned into my mind. The blue raspberry machine continued to hum. The worst part of the job, honestly, wasn't the late hours or the lingering smell of stale pizza. It was the cleaning. Specifically, the sticky residue left behind on the Dance Dance Revolution platforms. Every night, without fail, someone would spill something. Soda, slushy, what looked suspiciously like melted chocolate, and it would get ground into the plastic squares. I grabbed the industrial cleaner and a roll of paper towels, figuring I'd tackle the DDR platform closest to the front windows. It was a slow night, thankfully. Just a couple of teenagers huddled around the fighting games, mostly grunting at the screens. I sprayed the cleaner liberally. The chemical scent momentarily overpowered the usual arcade funk. It smelled like lemons and regret. I started wiping, scrubbing at the stubborn patches, trying to avoid getting the cleaner on the surrounding carpet. Bev usually handled this. She was a stickler for cleanliness. Still, it felt wrong that she hadn't called. Just gone. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:17 a.m. Her shift started at midnight. No text, no call, nothing. It was probably just a family thing, I told myself. She'd mentioned her mother wasn't doing well. People had emergencies. It didn't make it less unsettling, though. The cleaning was going okay, but it was taking longer than it should. The stuff was seriously sticky. I was getting a little frustrated, pushing harder with the paper towels, when I heard it. A flicker, not of the lights this time. A flicker in my peripheral vision near the prize counter. I didn't even bother turning my head. Just a shadow, probably. A trick of the light. The teenagers were still engrossed in their game. I kept scrubbing, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Then I heard it again. A shuffling sound, coming from the direction of the bathrooms. It wasn't the steady footfall of a person walking. It was dragged, like something was being pulled across the floor, and it was getting closer. I froze, my hand still gripping the paper towels. My pulse did something weird, not a racing or hammering, but a dull ache that spread from my chest to my jaw. It made my teeth feel gritty. And then, without thinking, I started to move. Not toward the sound, but away from it. I pushed back from the DDR platform, intending to get to the counter, to the relative safety of the open space. I started to walk, but it quickly escalated. My strides lengthened. I wasn't consciously deciding to run, but my legs were pumping, my feet barely touching the floor. I was moving faster and faster, heading for the front entrance. That's when the air shifted. Not temperature, not pressure, just a change in the quality of the air. It felt thick, like trying to breathe through cotton, and I remembered something. A fragmented thought, a warning dredged up from the procedural manual I'd skimmed during training. Something about pace, about not moving quickly, about attracting attention. A vague, unsettling feeling that running was wrong. I forced myself to slow down. It was a physical effort, like wading through molasses. Each step felt heavy, deliberate. I fought the urge to bolt, to just get out of the arcade, to be anywhere else. I concentrated on placing one foot in front of the other, focusing on the chipped tile beneath my shoes. Slow, deliberate, walk. I managed to get my speed down to a brisk walk, but my lungs were burning. It felt like I'd just run a sprint. I stopped at the front desk, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. The teenagers hadn't even noticed. They were still locked in their virtual battle. The shuffling sound had stopped. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking, but they were clammy. And there, under the fluorescent lights, I saw it. A thin layer of dust coating my palms. It wasn't the gray dust of the arcade. This was fine, almost silvery, like powdered metal. I rubbed my hands against my jeans, trying to get it off, but it clung to the fabric. It wasn't coming off. It was subtle, but it was there, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it hadn't been there before. I needed to check the drain again. I needed to see if that grid had grown, if the indentation was deeper. Not because I thought it would tell me anything, but because I couldn't stand not knowing. I grabbed the notepad from the counter, not to write, not yet. Just to have something in my hands. Something solid. I started walking toward the back room, each step measured, each breath controlled. And I noticed, as I walked, that the scent of lemons and regret from the cleaner had completely vanished, replaced by something else, something cold and metallic, like static electricity. I started with the prize counter. It was the worst part of the job, honestly. Not because of the kids, though the sheer volume of sticky fingers was a constant annoyance, but because of the sheer stuff. Rows and rows of plastic junk, all of it coated in a fine layer of dust and desperation. I was supposed to rotate the stock, pull the less popular items, and restock with the newer things. Mostly it meant rearranging the same 20 plush toys and keychains every night. It was quiet. The last of the birthday party kids had been shooed out around 11, and now it was nearly 2. The air conditioning hummed, a low, constant drone. I was methodically sorting through a bin of plastic rings, separating the chipped ones from the vaguely presentable ones. My back ached, a dull, familiar throb from years of leaning over restaurant counters. I thought about Petra, about how she'd probably be asleep now, finally getting some rest after her treatment. I pictured her face, pale but determined, and it was enough to push me through another pile of plastic garbage. I'd been at it for maybe 40 minutes, meticulously arranging the rings by color, when I noticed someone in the waiting area. A figure seated on one of the molded plastic chairs, facing the front window. It hadn't been there a moment ago, or maybe it had, and I'd just been focused on the rings. I squinted, trying to make out details in the dim light. It was a man, I think. Wearing a dark coat, even though it wasn't particularly cold. He wasn't looking at his phone or reading a book or doing anything at all. Just sitting. Perfectly still. A little jolt went through me. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was wrongness. This wasn't a parent waiting for a late child. This wasn't someone who'd missed the closing time and was waiting for a ride. This was someone who simply was. And then, the memory surfaced. Not a clear recall, more like a pressure behind my eyes. A feeling of something I'd read, a directive buried in the handbook, something about the waiting area, about not approaching, about getting someone else. I dismissed it immediately. Probably just some guy who'd fallen asleep. Or maybe he was waiting for someone who was still in the bathroom. It was a big arcade. People got delayed. I told myself that, repeating it like a mantra as I continued to sort the rings. But the image of the man, so still, so silent, stuck in my mind. I glanced up again, and he hadn't moved an inch. The rule, or the impression of a rule, insisted itself again, more strongly this time. Something about not being alone, about alerting a coworker. The problem was there was no coworker. Bev hadn't shown up, and I hadn't been able to reach her. I'd tried calling her cell 3 times, but it went straight to voicemail. The thought of calling Jerome, the manager, at this hour felt wrong. He'd be furious. But the feeling about the man in the waiting area was growing, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just a tired man waiting for something. But the longer I looked, the more uneasy I became. The man's posture was odd. His back was ramrod straight, his hands resting on his knees with an unnatural stillness, and the light from the street lamps caught a glint off something on his coat, something metallic. I abandoned the rings. I didn't even bother to smooth out the pile. I walked around the counter, keeping my eyes fixed on the man, and then I remembered the rule, the specific phrasing, or at least my recollection of it. If someone is in the public waiting area after closing time, do not approach them alone. Alert a coworker first. If no coworker is available, do not approach. It was absolute, no exceptions. I stopped about 10 feet from him. My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but I couldn't. The rule held me frozen. I completed the closing checklist from the safety of the counter, checked the bathrooms, locked the back door, verified the cash registers. Each task felt strangely frantic, like I was trying to create a buffer between myself and the still figure in the waiting area. I didn't dare look directly at him again. Everything felt off. The arcade, usually filled with the faint scent of popcorn and disinfectant, smelled like nothing at all. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to have stopped. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, and after I finished the checklist, I finally risked another glance. He was still there, still sitting, still perfectly, unnervingly still, but now his head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something. I finished the last of the closing tasks, double-checking everything, needing to do something. I shut off the main power switch, plunging the arcade into near darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows. The man was still there, a dark shape against the illuminated glass. When I finally turned away and walked toward the exit, I noticed something new. A fine, silvery dust, identical to the stuff on my hands, had settled on the chair next to him. It hadn't been there before. I locked the door behind me, and the feeling of wrongness didn't lessen. It amplified. It settled into my bones. I didn't call Jerome. I just started the car and drove home, trying not to think about the man in the waiting area, or the dust, or the unsettling silence. I needed to get home to Petra. I needed to make her pancakes. I needed to pretend for just a little while that everything was normal, but it wasn't. It hadn't been normal for a long time, and I knew, with a growing dread, that it was only going to get worse. The smell of cherry slushy was the first thing to hit me as I walked back in this morning. I'd forgotten about that. It clings to everything, even after you've scrubbed the counters down with industrial cleaner. I was restocking the prize machines, the little plastic rings, the bouncy balls, the cheap plastic dinosaurs. It was mindless work, good work for a brain that hadn't slept properly in days. Each little handful of rings tossed into the dispenser felt like a small victory against the general unraveling. Petra had slept okay. Thankfully, she'd been having trouble keeping down her medication, and the nights were the worst for nausea. I'd managed to get her to eat a few crackers and some ginger ale before I left. She'd been pale but smiling. That's what I focused on. The smile. It was harder and harder to remember what normal felt like, but her smile, that was close. That was a baseline. I was sorting the purple rings, trying to get the colors even, when I noticed it again. The dust. It was on the lip of the prize dispenser, a faint, shimmering powder, exactly the same color as the stuff I'd found on my hands last night, and near the man in the waiting area. I wiped at it with my thumb and it smeared, leaving a faint streak on the plastic. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't anything I recognized. Probably just some residue from the cleaning solution. We'd switched brands last week, and the new stuff was aggressive. That had to be it. It smelled different too, a faint chemical tang that hadn't been there before. I made a mental note to mention it to Jerome. Maybe he could get us back to the old cleaner. It was probably just irritating my skin, causing some kind of reaction. A rash, maybe. I rubbed my thumb again, harder this time, until the plastic felt slick. I finished the rings and moved on to the bouncy balls. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant, irritating drone. It was 9:17 a.m. Kira was scheduled to come in at 10, and I was supposed to prep the birthday party room. A 6-year-old named Weston was having a party, pizza, cake, and an hour of unlimited play. It sounded exhausting, even thinking about it. I started stacking the bouncy balls into neat pyramids, trying to picture Weston's face, trying to hold on to something bright. Then I heard her voice. "Hey, Kieran. You okay?" I turned around and saw Ines leaning against the doorway to the break room. She was one of the day shift attendants, usually bubbly and full of energy. Today, she looked concerned. She'd been working here for years, knew everyone, knew everything that went on. "Yeah, fine," I said. "Maybe a little too quickly. Just getting everything ready for Weston's party." She pushed herself off the doorframe and walked towards me, her expression still worried. "You seem distracted, and you look tired. Everything all right at home?" I hesitated. Petra's chemo, the bills, Bev disappearing, the dust, the man, the stillness. Everything felt like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to tell her. I needed to tell someone. But then that rule, that half-remembered fragment surfaced again, something about not talking about it, about not giving it shape. Something about not drawing attention if you see or hear something unusual. Just don't. "Everything's fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a long night, that's all." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face. I kept smiling, willing her to believe me. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I could feel my pulse thrumming in my ears. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, her voice flat. "Just checking. Let me know if you need anything." She turned and walked back into the break room, and the moment she was gone, the air felt colder, heavier. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my hands still clutching a handful of bouncy balls. I wanted to call her back. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain about the dust, about the man, about the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong, but I couldn't. The rule held me captive. I glanced towards the waiting area. It was empty, of course, but I couldn't shake the image of that man sitting there, perfectly still. And then I remembered Weston's party. The pizza. The cake. I'd ordered the pizza yesterday, specifically requesting it be delivered by 11:30 a.m. It was 9:42 a.m. I'd forgotten to check the delivery instructions. I'd forgotten to confirm the order. I'd been too focused on the dust, on Ines, on trying to pretend everything was okay. I needed to call the pizza place. I needed to make sure Weston's party wasn't ruined. But the phone was in the break room, where Ines was, and the rule felt like a physical barrier, preventing me from taking even a single step in that direction. I stood there, paralyzed, clutching the bouncy balls, the cheerful plastic a stark contrast to the growing dread in my chest. The cherry slushy smell, once comforting, now felt cloying, suffocating. I hadn't called, and Weston's party and everything else felt further away than ever. I spent a little over 1 hour restocking the prize counter. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was quiet. Mostly, the little plastic claws on the crane games made this faint, repetitive clicking sound, even when no one was playing. It was a sound I'd started to tune out, like the hum of the refrigerators. I lined up the plush aliens, the light-up yo-yos, the miniature basketballs. Each one had a little sticker with a price on it, 25 cents, 50 cents, $1. It felt productive, a small, contained task I could actually finish. Petra would appreciate that I was accomplishing something, even if it was just arranging cheap plastic toys. The fluorescent lights above the counter flickered occasionally. A low, almost imperceptible pulse. I tried to ignore it. Everything flickered these days, my vision sometimes when I hadn't slept enough. The bills on the kitchen counter, constantly shifting in amount. The hope that Petra would get better. I straightened a row of keychains, the metal cool and smooth under my fingertips. I'd started noticing the texture of things more, I guess. The way the carpet felt worn under my shoes, the slickness of the plastic cups, little details I hadn't paid attention to before. I finished with the keychains and moved on to the sticker packs. The glue on the backs was always a pain, sticking to your fingers. I peeled one off, carefully, and stuck it onto a new pack. Then another and another. The room was warm, stuffy even, despite the air conditioning. The scent of stale popcorn and cherry slushy hung in the air, a sickly sweet combination. I shifted in the folding chair I'd pulled up to the counter, trying to get more comfortable. It wasn't a great chair, plastic and hard, with a mesh back that didn't really breathe, but it was better than standing. My eyelids felt heavy. I hadn't been sleeping well. The chemo was rough on Petra, and worrying about the money it just built up, a weight on my chest. I leaned back in the chair just for a second to close my eyes, just a quick rest. I hadn't even realized how tired I was. The clicking of the crane games was still there, a steady rhythm. A comforting rhythm almost, then nothing. I woke up to darkness. Not just dimness, but absolute impenetrable blackness. The clicking was gone. The hum of the refrigerators was gone. Everything was silent. My neck was stiff, and my head throbbed. For a moment, I couldn't even remember where I was. Then it came back, in a rush, the prize counter, the arcade, the late shift. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, disconnected, like they didn't quite belong to me. And then I remembered a half-formed thought, a fragment of something I'd read weeks ago, buried in that ridiculous orientation manual. Something about sleeping, something about waking up. Don't fall asleep anywhere on the premises except the designated rest area. If you wake up anywhere else, do not move until you have spoken your name aloud. It felt ridiculous, even as the cold dread started to creep up my spine. Probably just some overzealous safety regulation, some way to make sure no one gets injured while unconscious. A stupid rule. But the darkness, it wasn't right. The arcade always had some ambient light, even when all the games were turned off. Emergency lights, at least. This was total. And the silence, it pressed in on me, suffocating. It wasn't the normal quiet of a closed arcade. It was empty. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a power outage, a blown fuse, but the emergency lights should still be on. And the silence, even a power outage, wouldn't explain that. I forced myself to breathe, slow and deep. I needed to get up, check the breakers, see what was going on. But the rule, it stuck in my mind, insistent and unsettling. Do not move until you have spoken your name aloud. It felt absurd, but the darkness, the silence, they were starting to feel less like a coincidence and more like a warning. "Kieran," I said, my voice raspy and unfamiliar in the blackness. The sound barely registered, swallowed by the silence. I waited, expecting something, anything, a flicker of light, a return of the hum. Nothing. I took a deep breath and pushed myself to my feet. My legs wobbled and I nearly fell. I reached out blindly, trying to find something to steady myself. My hand brushed against something cold and metallic, a shelf. I gripped it tightly, regaining my balance. Then I started to walk, slowly, cautiously, towards where I remembered the door to the main arcade floor to be. Each step felt heavier than the last. The darkness seemed to thicken with every movement. I kept expecting to bump into something, to trip over a stray prize, but there was nothing, just empty space. I reached the doorway and paused. The darkness beyond was even more profound. I couldn't see a single thing. I couldn't hear a single sound. It was like stepping into a void. I stood there for a long moment, frozen, my hand hovering over the light switch. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to know what was waiting on the other side. I didn't want to see what the darkness was hiding. I just stood there, listening to the blood rushing in my ears, the only sound in a world that had gone silent. I had spoken my name. I had complied. I had avoided something. But what? And what was waiting just beyond the doorway? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. The metallic dust, Bev, the man. All of it felt connected now, threads weaving into something I couldn't comprehend, something cold and dark and waiting. The smell of disinfectant was the first thing that really came back. That industrial lemon scent, the kind that clings to everything. I was wiping down the skee-ball lanes, moving mechanically. It was calming, actually, repetitive. Just swiping and swirling, getting the sticky residue from 1,000 tossed balls. It was 2:17 a.m. according to the time clock, and the arcade was utterly, blessedly empty. Petra hadn't called to cover my shift, so it was just me as usual. I was trying to focus on the lanes, on getting every smear of grime, but my mind kept drifting back to last night. The darkness, the absolute silence. It was probably just the emergency generator kicking out before the backup system engaged. Old building, temperamental wiring. And the silence? Maybe the ventilation system had cut out at the same time. It made sense, logically. Old equipment failing simultaneously. Still, I kept glancing at the shadows, especially near the prize counter where I'd fallen asleep. It felt different today somehow. Not actively threatening, just off. I finished with the skee ball and moved on to the racing games, wiping down the steering wheels and the plastic housings. It was a pointless task, really. They'd be covered in fingerprints again within an hour. But it gave me something to do, something to focus on besides the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. I'd been so tired. The chemo sessions were taking a toll on Sarah, and I was running on fumes. I hadn't even made pancakes this morning. Just toast, quickly, before rushing out the door. I felt a little guilty about that, even though she'd insisted I didn't need to. Then it hit me. A small thing, easily missed. I hadn't said it. When I'd clocked in, I hadn't said the thing, the phrase. The one from the orientation manual. It had been a hectic morning. Sarah hadn't been feeling well. There was a message from the hospital about a billing issue, and I was already running late. I just swiped my badge and walked in, assuming everything would be normal, but the manual was very specific. On arriving at the start of every shift, say the following phrase aloud before doing anything else. Something about acknowledging the space? It hadn't felt important at the time, just another layer of bureaucratic nonsense. But now, looking around, everything felt muted. The usual low-level hum of the arcade felt distant, like it was coming from another room. The colors seemed less vibrant. The air felt stagnant, heavier. I dismissed it, of course. It was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and paranoia. I was probably imagining things. It's just an arcade, a silly little arcade. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, like a piece of the puzzle hadn't been put in place. And the rule, that ridiculous, vaguely menacing rule, kept nagging at the back of my mind. You do not need to understand it. What did that even mean? It was like they were deliberately trying to make it unsettling. I swallowed hard and forced myself to remember the phrase. It was burned into my memory now. After rereading that section of the manual a dozen times last night, it was strange, archaic, utterly meaningless. The stars align where shadows play, and silence holds the coming day. I hated it. It sounded like something out of a bad fantasy novel. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and said it, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet arcade. The stars align where shadows play, and silence holds the coming day. Nothing happened. For a moment, I just stood there, feeling foolish. See, I'd overreacted. It was just a silly rule, a way to weed out the employees who didn't pay attention. I was being ridiculous. Then the lights flickered. Not a full outage, just a brief, unsettling stutter, and the temperature dropped. A sudden sharp chill that raised goosebumps on my arms. The disinfectant smell intensified, becoming cloyingly sweet, almost sickly, and the silence deepened. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore, it was an active silence, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I glanced towards the entrance, the waiting area. That's where the change felt most pronounced. The air there seemed to shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day. And then I saw it, or rather didn't see it. The security camera footage on the monitor above the front desk wasn't showing the waiting area. Just static. The camera was clearly functional. I could see the hallway and the entrance just fine. But the waiting area was a blank, flickering void. My breath hitched in my throat. I knew with a certainty that went beyond logic that saying the phrase hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't acknowledged the space. It had acknowledged something else. Something that had been waiting, unseen, unheard until I gave it a voice, the visitor count, Bev's absence, the drain. It wasn't random. It was all connected. I quickly checked the badge count again, still 27 returned, and then I remembered the party order from yesterday. The one for Weston's birthday. I hadn't prepared it, completely forgotten. A wave of nausea washed over me. It wasn't just forgetfulness, it was interference. Something was actively disrupting my ability to function. I turned away from the monitor, my hands clammy. I needed to get back to work to try and regain some semblance of control, but I knew deep down that it was too late. The arcade wasn't just an arcade anymore. It was something else, and I had just invited it in. I started gathering the prize tickets from the dispensing machines, needing to occupy my hands, needing to do something, anything, to avoid looking at the waiting area, at the flickering static where a room should be. The drive home was normal, that's what I kept telling myself. The highway was slick with a light rain. The wipers kept time with the radio. The taillights of the cars ahead blurred into red streaks. I even managed to find a decent classic rock station. I checked the rearview mirror more often than usual, not for cops, but just to see the road behind me. To confirm it was still there. It was. I hadn't called ENES after leaving. I didn't want to explain. Not yet. What was there to explain? A weird night. A broken slushy machine. A flickering security camera. A dumb phrase I had to say to get the lights back on. I told myself it was the stress, the bills, the worry about my wife. It was all building up, manifesting as hallucinations, maybe, sleep deprivation. I needed a good night's rest. A real breakfast with Sarah. Pancakes like always. The house was dark and quiet when I got in. Sarah was already asleep. The hallway light cast a soft glow around her. I didn't wake her. I just changed into sweatpants, made a cup of chamomile tea, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the chipped formica. I found myself counting the tiles on the floor. 1, 2, 3. I stopped abruptly. What was I doing? It was a compulsion, I realized, a physical need to order things, to quantify them. I hadn't noticed myself doing it before. I went to bed and lay awake for a long time, listening to Sarah's even breathing. Every little creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window felt amplified. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to find a logical explanation for everything. The waiting area, the static, the cold, the phrase. It was just a series of unfortunate events strung together by my own anxiety. That's all. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. The next morning, Sarah was still pale from the chemo, but she smiled when I made her pancakes. She even managed to eat a few strawberries. It was a small victory. I tried to act normal, to focus on her, but my mind kept drifting back to the arcade. I found myself subtly scanning the room, counting heads, noting the position of objects. It was exhausting. I haven't been back to the arcade since. I quit the next day, telling Weston I'd found another opportunity. He didn't push. He seemed relieved, actually. He said the place always gave him the creeps. I started picking up some freelance catering gigs, small parties mostly. It doesn't pay nearly as well, but it's worth it to avoid that building. A few weeks ago, I was driving to a gig, and I realized I'd taken a different route than usual. Without thinking, I'd steered clear of the street that passed the arcade. It wasn't a conscious decision, it just happened. I hadn't even realized I was avoiding it until I was already several blocks away. Now, every Sunday after breakfast, after I've cleaned the kitchen and Sarah's settled in for the day, I walk to the local hardware store. It's a small place, cluttered and dusty, with a smell of sawdust and metal, and it's right next to the arcade. I need something every week, usually. Light bulbs, cleaning supplies, a new screwdriver, something small. I go in, get what I need, and pay at the counter, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. I don't look at the arcade. I don't look at the windows. I don't look at the entrance. But I can feel it. A cold spot in the air. A faint static hum in my ears. And every time, before I leave the hardware store, I count the tiles on the floor. Just to be sure.